Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've always liked the quiet that comes with snow. It reminds me of rare things you don't get to summon, like catching lightning in the distance or spotting a shooting star. You don't control it, and most of the time it doesn't happen, which somehow makes it better when it does. I'm not someone who usually goes out hiking, but snow changes that for me. Everyone has those urges they give into without thinking too hard. This happened on one of those nights. I live near a lot of trees, not directly surrounded by forest, but close enough that if I wanted to be deep in it, I could get there with a short drive. I didn't have anything important to do the next day. I'm pretty sure it was a Saturday, mostly because I remember feeling a little rough from being out the night before. What stood out to me was that snow wasn't even in the forecast. I checked the weather constantly during winter, almost obsessively, so I know it wasn't expected. I was in my room reading when the snow just started all at once. There wasn't a build-up. It felt sudden, like something had been turned on without warning. I didn't notice immediately, but when I finally looked outside, the ground was already coated. I didn't debate it. I knew right away I wanted to go for a walk in it. I drove to a nearby trail that's usually pretty empty. It's quiet most of the time and far enough out that you don't see many people, especially late at night. I got out of the car, stood there for a moment just watching the snow come down, then started walking. I wasn't following any plan or route in my head. I just kept moving, letting myself drift farther in so I could really take it in. After about 20 minutes, I felt like I'd gone far enough. I stopped, finally letting myself focus on how still everything felt. That was when I heard it. It didn't fit. That was the only way I could describe it. A sound that didn't belong in that place at that time. It took a second to register and longer to accept. It was a child's voice. I hesitated, telling myself it was just my brain filling in the silence with something it recognized. Then it happened again. A small boy's voice, somewhere out in the trees, calling out, "Hi." On its own, that doesn't sound threatening. But standing there alone in the snow, miles from anywhere a kid should be, it was easily the most unsettling thing I could have heard. Another thing that bothered me was how hard it was to place where the voice had come from. It didn't sound close or far in any clear way. It felt like it could have been coming from several directions at once. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. I kept turning in place, looking harder than I probably needed to, but everything was empty. I had just decided I should head back toward my car when I heard it again. Same voice, definitely a child. This time it said, "Up here, silly." I didn't even stop to question how strange that was. I just looked up. That's when I saw him. A boy, maybe 9 years old, sitting casually on a branch in a nearby tree. It didn't make sense at first. He was dressed for the cold, wearing winter clothes, but the position he was in was wrong. The lowest branch on that tree was at least 20 feet off the ground. I couldn't figure out how he would have climbed it. Oddly enough, seeing him actually made me feel a little less on edge. Not knowing where the voice was coming from had been worse than seeing the source. I walked closer, never taking my eyes off him. He was smiling, too wide, in a way that felt unfinished, like someone copying an expression without really understanding it. That calm didn't last long. As I got closer, I noticed there were no footprints anywhere around the base of the tree. None at all. The snow was untouched. That meant he had climbed up before it started snowing, which also meant he'd been sitting up there for at least 45 minutes. And that didn't even begin to explain how he'd managed the climb. The trunk was straight, no low branches, nothing to grab onto. Even someone experienced would have struggled. He lifted a hand and waved. I immediately asked him how he got up there. He told me it was a secret, then went right back to smiling the same way. I froze. Something was clearly wrong, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do. He shouldn't have been out there, especially not alone, and I felt like I needed to help somehow. but I couldn't exactly climb the tree after him. Before I could say anything else, he stood up on the branch. He looked steady, almost confident, and said, "Watch this." Then he leaned backward and fell. It had to have been at least 30 feet. I screamed. It was the only reaction my body seemed capable of. I watched him hit the ground flat on his back with a dull, sickening sound. There was no way that fall should have been survivable. Snow or not, I was sure he was dead. I ran toward him anyway. Before I even got close, he snapped upright and bolted away from me. It didn't make sense. A fall like that should have broken him, if not worse. I shouted again, more out of disbelief than fear this time, and stood there watching him disappear farther into the trees. Even with the snow reflecting what little light there was, the woods swallowed him fast. I still don't understand why I followed him. Everything about it went against how I normally react. I'm the type to back away, to leave, to not push things. 99 times out of 10, I would have turned around immediately. This was the one time I didn't. That's the only explanation I have. I forced myself to calm down and focused on the ground, locking onto his footprints in the snow. He couldn't have gotten far. I took off after him again, and within seconds I heard him laughing. Laughing isn't even the right word. It was harsher than that, almost like he was enjoying it, like this was something he wanted. It felt deliberate, like I was being led somewhere while he played with me. His tracks passed close to a tree, and as I ran by it, something suddenly grabbed onto me from behind. I didn't even have time to react before I was pulled down hard into the snow. He was on top of me instantly, digging into my neck and shoulders. I started yelling and reaching for anything I could grab, but he clung to me. He was screaming too, a high, frantic sound, and I could feel warmth spreading along my neck. His fingernails were tearing into my skin, close enough to my face that I thought he might get my eyes. I don't know how I managed it, but I got back to my feet and used everything I had to throw him off me. I felt his weight leave my back as I flung him over my shoulder. He hit the ground, popped back up without hesitation, and ran off again, still laughing as he vanished deeper into the forest. That time I didn't follow. If it hadn't been for the blood on my hands and the stinging cuts along my neck, I might have just stood there, frozen. The wounds didn't feel deep, but there was far more blood than I was comfortable seeing. I wasn't wearing a scarf, so I took off my hat and wrapped it tight around my neck, pressing hard. My hands were shaking. I was panicking, struggling to breathe, and everything felt unreal. The next 20 minutes are blurry. I think I lost track of time because of how scared I was and how much blood I'd already lost. The next clear memory I have is being in the back of an ambulance. After that, I remember sitting somewhere warm, answering questions from police officers about what had happened. I got treated for my injuries and ended up telling the same story over and over again. At the time, I didn't really understand why everyone seemed so skeptical. It all felt very straightforward to me. It wasn't until later that I found out what the police had, or hadn't, found while I was in the hospital. They told me they'd gone back to the area and searched it thoroughly. According to them, there was nothing out there, no sign of anyone. What bothered me even more was when they said they followed the footprints in the snow and only found one set, mine. I remember getting really upset when I heard that. I was convinced they must not have looked hard enough. I was angry, frustrated, and honestly kind of desperate for someone to confirm that what I experienced had actually happened. But at the same time, I couldn't figure out why they would lie about something like that. By the time I was released and finished answering questions, I was completely drained. I didn't have the energy to do much of anything except go home and sleep. I can't remember exactly how long it was after, maybe a day, maybe two, but eventually I went back to the trail myself. There had been a lot more snow since then, so it wasn't surprising that any tracks I'd left were gone. Still, I walked through the area anyway. I searched for hours, covering as much ground as I could manage. I didn't find anything. No signs of movement, no broken branches, nothing that suggested anyone else had ever been there. To this day, it's one of the most disturbing things that's ever happened to me, or to anyone I know personally. This was during winter break in my sophomore year of college. I was 19 and my parents were out of town, so I had the house to myself for almost 2 weeks. Sometime during the second week, a huge snowstorm rolled in. The weather reports had been hyping it up for days, and for once they weren't exaggerating. When I woke up that Saturday morning, there was already nearly a foot of snow outside, and it was still falling hard. The plows couldn't keep pace, and by mid-afternoon the roads were basically unusable. The area I grew up in isn't a tight suburban grid. The houses sit far apart, with a lot of trees and empty space between them. It's quiet and pleasant most of the year, but in winter it can feel a little cut off. That day especially, with the snow still coming down and not a single car passing by, the whole place felt empty. By around 6 that evening, I was completely bored. The internet had gone out sometime overnight, so I couldn't even distract myself with games or videos. For reference, I only really had one close friend back home, a guy named Ryan, and I knew he was around because we'd hung out just the day before. Lying in my room with nothing to do, I came up with what seemed like a funny idea at the time. I'd walk over to his place and surprise him. Driving was out of the question, but I figured walking wouldn't be a big deal. His house was maybe 1.5 miles away. I'd walked farther than that plenty of times. In hindsight, it wasn't a smart plan, but I was 19, restless, and thought it'd be amusing to show up at his door soaked and covered in snow. At first, the walk was actually kind of pleasant. The snowfall had eased up, and everything was buried under a smooth, untouched layer of white. The streetlights reflected off the snow and gave the whole road this soft glow. It was quiet in a way that felt calm rather than creepy. I could hear my boots crunching and my own breathing and nothing else. There wasn't a person, animal, or car anywhere. About halfway through, the road passes through a section without any houses for a while. Just trees lining both sides and a couple of vacant lots. It's completely ordinary during the day, but that night, with the snow and the silence, it felt different. That was when it really sank in how alone I was out there. The feeling was hard to describe, just a sudden awareness of how isolated everything was. I kept walking, and then, without warning, I noticed headlights in the distance ahead of me. The lights were a long way off at first, but they were coming from the same direction I was heading. I stopped and stood there, watching them inch closer through the snowfall. It was clearly a snow plow, crawling along at a slow pace. Then, without any warning, it swerved sharply to the right. It didn't look controlled at all, more like the driver had jerked the wheel or lost traction. The headlights cut across the road and vanished into the trees. A dull, heavy crunch followed, muted by the snow. After that, everything went silent again. My immediate reaction was that someone had just crashed. I started moving toward where I'd seen the plow leave the road. Running was difficult with the snow up past my ankles, but at the time I wasn't thinking about that. All I could focus on was the idea that someone might be hurt and needed help. It took a few minutes to get there. The tracks were easy to spot, carving straight off the road and into the trees, so I followed them until I reached the vehicle. It was exactly what I expected to find. A snow plow buried nose first into a tree, the front end crushed in. The headlights were still on, shining into the woods, and I could hear the engine idling. I hurried to the driver's side, bracing myself for what I might see. I was already thinking about how I'd get someone out through the snow, but when I looked inside, the seat was empty. I stood there for a moment, confused, staring into the cab. My next thought was that maybe the driver had been thrown from the plow, so I scanned the area around it. The windshield wasn't broken, though, which didn't make sense if that had happened. I checked the passenger side anyway. That seat was empty too. Getting frustrated and a little panicked, I pulled the driver's door open, half expecting to find someone slumped down out of sight. There was nothing. That was when it finally clicked that the entire vehicle was empty. There was nowhere else anyone could have been. I remember just standing there in the snow, looking at this wrecked plow with its lights on and its engine still running, trying to understand what I was seeing. There were no footprints around it at all, no tracks leading away. Whoever had been driving hadn't walked off. I can't really put into words what came over me after that. It wasn't a clear thought, more like a sudden, heavy urge to leave immediately. Something deep in my gut told me I shouldn't be there anymore. I didn't argue with it. I slowly backed away from the plow. I had just started heading back the way I came when I heard someone call out behind me. It was a man's voice, shouting for help. That should have been enough to make me turn around. That was the whole reason I'd run toward the crash in the first place. But every instinct in my body was telling me not to stop, not to look back. I picked up my pace, then broke into a run. As I got farther away, I heard the voice again. This time it sounded much closer than it should have been, way too close. There was no way someone could have moved that fast through snow that deep. I didn't turn around, I just kept running. I ran the rest of the way to Ryan's house without stopping. Any idea of surprising him was gone by then. When his mom opened the door, I'm sure I looked completely unhinged, out of breath, soaked and shaking. I tried to explain what had happened, stumbling over my words. Ryan's dad ended up calling the police. While we waited for them to arrive, Ryan and I went over the whole thing again and again. He kept asking if maybe I'd imagined parts of it or if the driver could have wandered off before I got there. I knew what I saw. I was certain of it. I hadn't been confused or half asleep. I'd been standing right there. When the police finally made it through the snow and came back to the house, what they told us made my stomach drop. They said there were no tire tracks on that road at all. They'd checked the entire stretch and found nothing. No evidence a plow had gone off the road. No sign one had even passed through. One of the officers straight up suggested I'd made the whole thing up. I remember arguing with him, trying to convince him I wasn't lying. I was close to begging at that point. Eventually, he just shut the conversation down and left. There was nothing else I could do. I stayed at Ryan's place that night. I didn't want to be outside again after dark, and honestly, I don't think I could have forced myself to leave even if I wanted to. The next morning, once the roads were finally cleared, Ryan's dad drove me home. I still think about that night a lot. Every time I do, I end up at the same place. There's no good explanation for what happened. Maybe my mind filled in gaps that weren't really there. But if that's true, that possibility scares me just as much. I'm Sebastian, though most people call me Sebi. This happened back when I was a sophomore in high school, so about 7 years ago. I went to private school in a nearby city, which meant commuting every day on public transport. Mornings, afternoons. It was just part of the routine. Honestly, I didn't mind it that much. A lot of my friends lived in the same area, so we'd ride together, and it kind of became a time to hang out, talk, joke around. I guess one of the quiet perks of private school was just getting used to traveling alone early on. I ran track back then. Spring was track season, fall was cross country. Outside of that, after school ended around 3, the train was usually nearly empty. Just a handful of other students heading home. But during track season, practice would run late, usually until after 5:30. By the time I got on the train, it was full of people coming home from work. Luckily, my 2 closest friends, Charles and James, ran track too and lived along the same line, so at least I wasn't riding alone on those late nights. One evening after practice, it started snowing hard the instant our train left the station. Night technically, though it wasn't even 6 yet. And it didn't just snow, it escalated fast, like a sudden blizzard. We ended up learning that ours was the last train running on that line. The weather forecast had warned of a major storm, and no more trains would leave the station once we were gone. The snow kept falling heavier and heavier. At some point, the 3 of us started wondering if the train would even make it to our stops, And even if it did, there was no way our parents could get to us. The streets were already chaos. So we were going to have to walk home no matter what. For Charles and James, that wasn't a big deal. They lived in a dense, busy part of town, just a short walk from the station. For me, though, it was a whole different story. My stop was pretty isolated. From there, I'd have to cross a highway and then walk more than a mile through a wooded area to get home. I called my parents while I was still on the train and explained what was happening. They didn't really have a solution. My dad told me to layer up, deal with it, and be careful. There wasn't much else to say. James and Charles got off at their stop first. I said goodbye, gave them a quick dap, and watched them disappear into the snow. After that, the train felt emptier with every stop. By the time we pulled into my station, I was the only passenger left. The doors opened and I stepped out onto the platform. It was completely empty, just me, the station, and the storm. It was dark, but the snow made everything oddly visible. The ground, the tracks, the platform, everything was covered in white, and the overhead lights reflected off it in a way that was almost calm but unsettling. I stood there for a moment just looking around. I'd never seen the place like that before. Normally there were cars, people, noise. That night it felt abandoned. Eventually I started walking. There was no reason to stall. I expected the highway crossing to be the worst part, but when I got there it was completely empty. No cars, no headlights, not even a snowplow. I stopped in the middle of it and looked around, honestly stunned. It was strangely quiet and kind of beautiful in a way I couldn't explain. I remember thinking I'd probably never see anything like it again. Once I crossed the highway, though, the woods were next. I could have followed the road instead, but it would have meant a longer walk and dealing with the wind, so I decided to cut through the trees like I always did. I kept my head down, watching my footing as I walked. I don't know how much time passed before I finally looked up. When I did, my chest tightened and I had to stop myself from shouting. About 30 yards ahead of me, someone was standing there. A man. He was facing straight toward me, positioned almost perfectly in the path I had to take. For a second, my brain just stalled. None of it made sense. He wasn't dressed for the weather at all, short sleeves, shorts in the middle of a blizzard. And his face, it was pulled into this wide, unnatural smile. I froze. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just stared at him, waiting for him to do something. My thoughts were spinning, trying to come up with a normal explanation, but the shock of it all made it hard to think clearly. I froze completely, unable to think or move, and then in a sudden, impossible motion, he went from just standing there smiling to screaming and charging straight at me. It was like something out of a nightmare, happening in real life. Something clicked in me, and I started running as fast as I could back the way I came, yelling for help even though I knew there was no one around to hear me. The snow slowed me down, and I could feel him getting closer with every step. The chase felt endless. It probably only lasted a few minutes, but in my mind it stretched on forever. Finally, I burst out of the woods onto the road and I dared to look back. He was gone. That didn't make me feel much better. I was still shaking, my stomach in knots. I followed the road the rest of the way home, constantly thinking about my footprints. They were the only marks in the snow, and it made me panic just imagining how easy it would have been for him to follow me. When I got inside, my parents were obviously relieved to see me. That relief vanished the moment I told them what had happened in the woods. My dad wanted to go out and look for him, but my mom wouldn't let him. Hours passed without any sign of him. Eventually, my parents went to sleep, and I tried to act normal, though inside I was completely on edge. I couldn't get that twisted, unnatural smile out of my head or the way he had been screaming. It didn't sound human. And the fact that he'd been wearing short sleeves in the middle of a blizzard. I kept trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. I forced myself to stop thinking and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. It felt like being stuck in that half-second shock after waking from a nightmare, except stretched over hours. Then, I heard a branch scraping against my bedroom window and my heart jumped. I got up to check, hopping to push it away, and when I pulled the curtain back, I nearly collapsed, screaming. He was there, right outside the window, inches away. This time I could see him clearly. His skin was purple, like he was freezing, and he was bald with a patchy gray beard. My dad rushed in just in time to catch a glimpse before the man bolted. My dad immediately tried to run outside after him, but my mom stopped him and talked him into calling the police instead. With how bad the storm was, it took a long time for them to arrive. By the time they finally showed up, the man was obviously gone. That didn't seem to bother my dad much at first. With fresh snow everywhere, it felt like it should have been easy to follow where the guy went. I fully expected that's what they'd do. But once the officers saw that the footprints led into the woods behind our house, their tone changed. They said they weren't going to head into the trees in the middle of the night during a blizzard. My dad completely lost it. He started yelling, got right up in one of their faces, and for a second I thought it was actually going to turn into a fight. It didn't, but it was close. In the end, the officers just left. That was it. Nothing came of it at all. There was no follow-up, no calls, nothing. I never saw that man again. Sometimes I think about the fact that he might have frozen somewhere in those woods behind our house, and I don't know how I feel about that. For weeks after, I was scared to even be inside my own home. I still don't have any explanation for what actually happened.